August 2nd, 1944. Midnight over the Balkans. A single American aircraft cuts through the clouds above central Serbia, deep inside territory held by Nazi Germany. Below, a faint orange glow flickers in the distance. A fire, burning steady in the middle of a mountain meadow near a village called Pranjani. That's the signal. The pilot banks hard, engines growling low. 3 silhouettes move toward the open hatch. One by one, they leap into the blackness. Parachutes snap open against the cold wind, floating them into the shadowed tree line. The first to land was Captain George Musulin, 29 years old, Serbian American, born in New York, raised in Pennsylvania. A college football star from Pittsburgh, the 1937 National Championship team. He'd gone pro, Chicago, St. Louis, Pittsburgh. A big man, 6'3", shoulders like a wall, but calm under pressure. Now, instead of helmets and cleats, he wore a sidearm, a compass, and an OSS patch, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence force that would one day become the CIA. With him were 2 men, Master Sergeant Michael Rajacich, a radio operator fluent in Serbian, quick-thinking and steady-handed, and Specialist Arthur Jibilian, just 21, a communications expert from Ohio, Lebanese-American, who didn't know a word of the language but could make any radio sing. They landed rough, hard terrain, low trees, sharp rocks, but all 3 survived the drop. They worked fast, gathering parachutes, radio gear, medical kits, and small arms. Within minutes, dark shapes emerged from the forest, men with rifles slung across their backs, wearing worn uniforms and thick beards. These were Chetniks, Serbian guerrilla fighters loyal to General Draža Mihailović, a man the Germans had hunted for 3 long years. The Americans were led through the woods to a farmhouse, its windows blacked out. Inside, by a small lantern's glow, stood Mihailović himself, 51, a former colonel in the Royal Yugoslav Army, a steel gaze under a gray beard. He'd been fighting since the day Yugoslavia fell in 1941. His men controlled scattered mountain villages. The Germans held the cities, the roads, the rails. Mihailović didn't waste time. He spoke through an interpreter. "Your men are safe, all of them. We've done what we can," he said. Musulin frowned. "How many?" 250, maybe more, hidden across the hills. We are bringing them here." 250 American airmen, shot down over Yugoslavia, saved by Serbian peasants and Chetnik fighters. They'd been fed, clothed, and hidden for weeks from German patrols that would have executed anyone caught helping them. It was the beginning of Operation Halyard, the largest rescue of Allied airmen in World War II. And it almost never happened. 6 weeks earlier, at the 15th Air Force headquarters in Bari, Italy, the numbers painted a grim picture. The U.S. bombers had been hammering the oil fields of Ploesti, Romania, Hitler's lifeline of fuel. The strikes were successful, but the cost was staggering. B-24 Liberators and B-17 Fortresses, each packed with 10 young crewmen, were falling from the sky every week. The route from Italy to Romania and back was a 1,500-mile gauntlet through flak, fighters, and German-occupied Yugoslavia. Those who bailed out landed among enemies, or, if luck held, among the rugged mountains of Serbia. Most were captured within hours. Some weren't so fortunate. But whispers had begun to filter through the Allied intelligence network. Coded radio messages from deep within Yugoslavia spoke of American pilots being sheltered, not by communists, not by collaborators, but by the royalist resistance, Mihailović's men. It was a problem that stretched far beyond the battlefield. Early in the war, Britain had backed Mihailović. They sent supplies, officers, and praise. But by 1944, Winston Churchill had shifted his support to Josip Broz Tito, a communist partisan leader trained in Moscow and favored by Stalin. The British believed Tito's men were doing more to fight the Germans, and so, under political pressure, they cut ties with Mihailović's forces. When Churchill changed course, Washington followed. President Roosevelt, trusting Churchill's judgment, withdrew American missions from Mihailović's territory. The general was left isolated, cut off from supplies, recognition, and allies. But the downed airmen remained. Hundreds of them, scattered across Serbia, relying on villagers who risked their lives to protect them. The 15th Air Force couldn't just walk away. They needed someone to go in. Someone who spoke the language, who knew the land, who could organize a rescue under the Germans' nose. Captain Musulin volunteered. He'd already been there once before, in 1943, parachuting into Mihailović's headquarters on a liaison mission. He'd seen firsthand how the Serbs treated captured airmen, offering food they didn't have, hiding men in barns, cellars, and attics, sharing everything and expecting nothing in return. Entire villages risked annihilation to protect strangers from across the sea. When Musulin returned to Italy with 40 rescued airmen that winter, he filed his report. His message was simple: Mihailović is still saving Americans. But by then, British politics had slammed the door shut. Any operation supporting the Chetniks was deemed too sensitive. It might anger Tito, strain relations with the partisans, complicate Allied diplomacy. Musulin didn't care about politics. He bypassed the chain of command and went straight to General William Wild Bill Donovan, the OSS chief in Washington. He laid it out plainly. Hundreds of American boys are alive in Serbia because of these people, but the Germans are closing in. If we don't act soon, they'll be captured, or worse. Donovan listened, and he didn't hesitate. He took the matter directly to President Roosevelt. The president, hearing that American airmen were trapped behind enemy lines because of bureaucratic hesitation, gave the order himself. Get them out. Politics be damned. British government, cornered by Roosevelt's insistence, reluctantly agreed to cooperate. Thus, Operation Halyard was born. But the clock was ticking fast. The Germans had already caught wind that American fliers were hiding somewhere in Serbia. Patrols intensified, villages were searched, rewards were offered for information. Anyone caught helping them faced execution. Entire families, entire communities. And as if that wasn't enough, Tito's communist partisans were pressing eastward, aiming to eliminate Mihailović's forces before the war ended. The Serbs were fighting the Germans, but a civil war within a world war. Musulin assembled his team, Rajacich and Jibilian, both volunteers, both willing to risk their lives to bring their countrymen home. Their orders were clear: parachute into German-held Serbia, link up with Mihailović, organize the scattered airmen, build a makeshift airstrip, and signal Allied aircraft for evacuation. The odds were near impossible. The first attempt to drop them in failed on July 15th, aircraft malfunction. Second attempt, July 20th, bad weather, heavy cloud cover. Third attempt, July 28th, navigation error, couldn't locate the signal fire. Each failure meant more danger for the stranded airmen. German patrols were tightening their noose. By the fourth attempt, August 2nd, everything finally lined up. Clear skies, accurate coordinates, the signal fire bright in the night. The pilot banked in low. 3 silhouettes blossomed against the darkness. They were in.
Within minutes, they made contact with the Chetniks. By dawn, they were standing in front of General Mihailović himself. "You came," the general said, with a tired but proud smile. "Your men are waiting." Musulin scanned the small farmhouse filled with maps, rifles, and exhausted fighters. Outside, the hills were alive with activity. Messengers arriving on foot, couriers carrying word across the valleys. The Serbs were already moving. The Americans had come to rescue 250 airmen. Mihailović's men would make sure they lived long enough to be rescued. But there was a problem. No airfield. Central Serbia was rugged, forested, and steep. Transport planes needed at least 600 yards of flat ground to land.
By the time the last American transport left Serbia in late autumn of 1944, the airstrip at Ploesti lay silent again. The villages dismantled what was left. Wooden markers, empty fuel drums, tire ruts that would fade with the winter rains. The Germans had never found it. The operation was a perfect success. Yet for the people who had made it possible, the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the beginning of disappearance. Captain George Musulin returned to Italy to a hero's welcome from the men he'd saved. They hugged him, thanked him, lifted him onto their shoulders. Some promised they'd tell the world about what the Serbs had done, how poor farmers, led by a forgotten general, had saved hundreds of Americans under the nose of the Nazis. But back at OSS headquarters, Musulin found a different kind of reception. His mission report, the one describing Mihailović's men, the villagers, the entire operation, was marked classified, limited distribution. His superiors congratulated him politely, then told him to move on. "Washington's shifting its focus," one officer said quietly. "Tito's the guy now. Moscow likes him. London likes him. That's the line." Musulin stared at him. "What about the people who helped us? What about Mihailović?" The officer hesitated. "You've done your duty. Leave the rest to diplomacy." Diplomacy. That word, smooth, empty, and cold, hung in the air like smoke. In the hills of western Serbia, Mihailović's world was collapsing. The Germans were retreating north, but Tito's communist partisans were sweeping in from the south and east, backed by Soviet tanks. For 3 years, Mihailović's army had been fighting both occupiers and rivals. They were tired, short on supplies, and surrounded by propaganda that painted them as traitors. By winter, villages that once flew royalist flags now raised red stars. The same Allied planes that had once dropped weapons to the Chetniks were now dropping them to Tito's men. British liaison officers who had once praised Mihailović now called him a relic. And somewhere in all the shifting headlines and diplomatic briefings, Operation Halyard, the rescue that should have made Mihailović a hero, was buried under silence. The Americans had been told to say nothing. Back in Italy, the rescued airmen were interrogated for intelligence reports. They told their stories, how villagers risked death to hide them, how the Chetniks fed them with their last loaf of bread, how Mihailović's soldiers built a runway by hand. But when the official summaries reached London, certain words disappeared. Chetnik became local guerrillas. Mihailović was omitted entirely. Some officers protested, but the war was ending and the politics of peace were already being written. Tito's Yugoslavia was the future. Mihailović's Serbia was the past. One airman, Lieutenant Richard Fellman, refused to stay silent. He wrote letters to his commanders, to Congress, to the press. He said, "We owe those people our lives. You can't pretend it didn't happen." But the world was tired of new heroes. In early 1945, Musulin returned to Washington for debriefing. He carried a small folder of photos, the airfield at Ploesti,
The villagers smiling beside downed pilots, the Chetnik guards standing proud with rifles. He handed them to an OSS official in a gray suit. "These people saved 500 of our boys," Musulin said. "They deserve recognition, supplies, something." The official thumbed through the photos without looking up. "I understand, Captain, but the situation in the Balkans has changed." "Changed?" Musulin repeated. "They're still over there. They bled for us." The man sighed. "Our policy supports Tito now. He's unifying the region. We can't complicate that." Musulin leaned forward. "You're saying politics matter more than truth?" The official gave a tight smile. "I'm saying politics is truth, Captain. You've done excellent work. Take some leave. The OSS appreciates your service." And just like that, the file disappeared into a cabinet. Operation Halyard was over, on paper at least. Meanwhile, Mihailović was running out of time. By spring of 1945, his forces were scattered. The Germans had surrendered, but Tito's new government had declared the Chetniks enemies of the people. Posters went up in every town. Mihailović, war criminal. The general who had once commanded tens of thousands now moved from mountain to mountain with a handful of loyal men. The same forests that had sheltered American pilots now hid him. He carried no radio, no supply lines, no hope of rescue. In March 1946, they caught him. A partisan patrol ambushed his convoy near Visegrad. Wounded and exhausted, Mihailović was dragged to Belgrade and thrown into a cell beneath the new government's Ministry of Interior. The trial was quick, public, and political. Tito's courts accused him of collaborating with the Germans, of betraying the resistance, of opposing the new socialist state. Mihailović refused to confess. He said, "I fought the Germans when others hid in the forests. I saved your allies' sons while you courted Stalin. If that's treason, history will decide." He was sentenced to death. On July 17, 1946, at dawn, they led him to a courtyard outside the fortress at Belgrade. No witnesses were allowed. No body was ever recovered. The man who saved hundreds of Americans was executed as a traitor, unrecognized, unmentioned, forgotten. When the news reached the States, most Americans never even heard his name. The story was buried deep in European dispatches, a few inches of type, a footnote to a different victory. But for the airmen who had saved him, the silence was unbearable. They gathered, wrote petitions, demanded that the U.S. government speak up. One of them, Major Richard L. Fellman, testified before Congress, saying, "If it were not for General Mihailović, none of us would be alive today. He fought for liberty when the world turned its back on him." Still, no medal, no ceremony, no acknowledgement came. The Cold War had begun, and Tito was now America's ally against Stalin. Admitting that the U.S. owed its soldiers' lives to Tito's rival would have been inconvenient, so the truth stayed buried. Years passed. The airmen returned home, married, had children, grew old. But none of them forgot. They kept in touch, writing letters and organizing small reunions, not for themselves, but for the man they couldn't thank in person. In 1966, on the 20th anniversary of Mihailović's execution, a group of surviving airmen gathered in Washington. They brought with them photos, diaries, and faded uniforms. At the center of the table sat an empty chair, draped with a Serbian flag. One by one, they spoke. I remember him standing by the runway watching us leave. He saluted the plane. I didn't even wave back. I thought we'd see him again. Another said quietly, He told us, "Don't forget Serbia." We didn't, but America did. They raised their glasses in silence. Finally, in 1948, long after the war had ended and the world had redrawn its maps, the truth began to surface again. The OSS declassified portions of its reports, revealing the details of Operation Halyard. Journalists who read them were stunned. The story was unlike anything else in the war. Not just the scale of the rescue, but the moral weight of it. 500 American airmen saved by the very people their government later condemned. But it took decades for the U.S. to act. In 2005, 60 years after the war, the U.S. Congress finally recognized General Draža Mihailović with a posthumous Legion of Merit. The citation read, "For outstanding services to the United States in the rescue and care of American airmen during World War II." The medal was presented privately to his daughter, Gordana, in Belgrade. No speeches, no parades, just quiet justice, decades late. And as for Captain George Musulin, he left the OSS soon after the war ended. He was frustrated, disillusioned by how easily truth had been traded for diplomacy. He returned to civilian life, became a contractor, and rarely spoke publicly about the mission. But friends said that sometimes, late at night, after a few drinks, he'd pull out an old black-and-white photo. The airfield at Pranjani, the men standing.
By the winter of 1944, the winds over the Balkans carried no echoes of propellers. The valley that had once roared with C-47s and laughter now slept beneath a blanket of snow. The field, that impossible runway carved by hand in defiance of the Reich, was silent again, a scar fading into the white. The men who'd been saved were back in Italy, some already redeployed, others convalescing in hospitals. For them, the mission was over. But for those left behind, the villagers, the Chetniks, the few Americans who stayed, the story had only begun to settle into memory, like smoke after battle. Operation Halyard had rescued 512 airmen without losing a single one, a feat unmatched in the history of war. Every takeoff from that mountain strip had been a coin toss with death, and yet not one had failed. That kind of perfection didn't feel human. It felt providential. But Providence has a cruel sense of irony. The men who'd made it possible, Mihailović and his fighters, the peasants who'd risked their entire villages, would soon be erased from the official story. As the Allies advanced and the politics of post-war Europe shifted, loyalties were rewritten like maps. Tito's communist forces, now favored by the West, branded the royalist Chetniks as collaborators. Mihailović, the man whose soldiers had guarded hundreds of American airmen, was captured, tried, and executed in 1946 by the very nation he'd fought to defend. His name was buried under propaganda. His soldiers scattered or vanished into prisons. And for decades, the story of Halyard faded, classified, censored, forgotten. The airmen who'd lived because of him tried to speak out. They wrote letters to newspapers, to Congress, to the Pentagon. "We were there," they said. "We saw what he did." But the world had moved on to new fears, the Iron Curtain, the Cold War, the Red Dawn of ideology. A handful of men telling war stories from the mountains of Serbia didn't stand a chance against that tide. So the truth slept, waiting for someone to remember. Years passed. The airmen grew older. Some built families. Others carried quiet guilt, survivor's guilt, the kind that gnaws at you when you've been pulled from hell while others were left behind. They met for reunions, shared photographs, laughed about the runway that wasn't. They toasted to Musulin, Jibilian, Krager, to the farmers, the women, the children who lit the lamps. And always, before the night was done, someone would say it softly, "To Mihailović," and every glass would rise. In 1953, a few of them tried again. They petitioned Washington to honor Mihailović. For years, silence. Then, in 1948, quietly, privately, President Truman approved a Legion of Merit citation for General Draža Mihailović, recognizing his role in saving the lives of American fliers. It was classified secret for decades. No ceremony, no public acknowledgement. Just a folded paper in a drawer. Because by then, the world couldn't afford to celebrate a man branded an enemy of the new Yugoslavia. But time has a way of clawing back the truth. As the Iron Curtain rusted and fell, old stories resurfaced. The sons and daughters of those rescued men began to dig. They found diaries, photographs, radio transcripts. They traced the coordinates of that impossible airstrip and found it still there, faint but unmistakable, etched into the Serbian soil, a scar of courage that no map could erase. In the 1990s, American veterans began returning to that land. Some could barely walk, but they made the journey anyway. They met the children of the villagers who'd saved them, now gray-haired themselves. One woman told a reporter, "My mother used to say the angels flew from our valley that summer." Another said, "We never knew your names, only that you were good men." The airmen wept. For them, the war finally ended on that soil. Arthur Jibilian, the radio man, lived long enough to see the story finally told. In his later years, he visited schools, museums, and veterans halls, recounting those nights by the radio, those flights into darkness. "We didn't save them," he'd say. "They saved us, every one of them." When he died in 2010, he was buried with full honors. At his funeral, they played the hum of C-47 engines over the loudspeakers. The villagers of Pranjani, where the airfield once stood, built a small monument. Nothing grand, just a stone pillar and a plaque that reads in Serbian and English. In this field, between August and December 1944, the peoples of Serbia and the forces of the United States worked together to rescue 512 Allied airmen. Their friendship lives on. And it does live on. Each year, descendants from both sides gather there, Americans, Serbs, and others, laying wreaths, sharing stories, lighting candles. The valley echoes again with the sound of propellers, but now from commemorative flyovers, a salute to the ghosts of that skyway to freedom. The story of Operation Halyard isn't just a tale of rescue. It's a reminder of what courage looks like when no one's watching, of how humanity can rise from the wreckage of war. It's about farmers who stood against empires, children who risked death to light a runway, and soldiers who chose honor over safety. It's about strangers who, for a few fleeting weeks in 1944, forgot their flags and remembered their souls. In the grand machinery of history, such stories are small gears, overlooked, unsung, yet essential. Without them, the machine doesn't turn. And though nations may change and politics may twist truth into something unrecognizable, the night sky over Serbia will always remember the sound of those engines and the courage of the hands that guided them home. Somewhere out there, in that quiet valley, the wind still moves through the grass, whispering in two languages, one word that means the same in both: freedom.